The city of Riverside was alive with the hum of car engines and the soft glow of streetlights that painted the evening sky, setting the stage for a life-altering encounter. On what seemed like a regular night in the city, a routine traffic stop would spiral into an unexpected confrontation, forever changing the lives of those involved. The events unfolded in a way that no one could have anticipated, as a young black woman, targeted and harassed by a police officer known for crossing the line, would soon find herself in a position of power, presiding over the very officer who had wronged her. As she walked into the courtroom in her judicial robes, the room fell silent. The officer, unaware of the twist of fate awaiting him, would soon face a reality that he had never imagined. It was just past twilight in Riverside. The bustling city had not quieted down as the workday ended. Instead, the streets were now filled with a new surge of energy, as the nightlife began to take over. Restaurants opened their doors to late-night patrons. Neon signs flickered above windows, casting a colorful reflection on the rain-slicked pavement. The busy streets hummed with the steady rhythm of car engines and honking horns, while pedestrians weaved in and out of parked cars. Laughter echoed in the cool air, blending with the distant sound of sirens as the city's pulse quickened. At a small diner on the outskirts of downtown, Officer Jason Clark was finishing his late-night coffee. He drummed his fingers on the counter, scanning the day's issue of the Riverside News. In his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, Officer Clark had grown weary after 2 decades on the force. His once idealistic views about law enforcement had turned cynical, colored by a long history of racial profiling and a hardened perspective on certain neighborhoods he considered trouble. His approach to policing had become more about flexing power than serving justice, and over the years, his actions had shifted from the noble to the questionable. Sighing deeply, Clark tossed the newspaper aside and drained the last of his coffee. He paid the check, leaving only a small tip, and stepped out into the crisp early autumn air. The wind nipped at his neck as he pulled his jacket tighter, his restlessness palpable. He eased into his squad car, his mind still set on scanning the streets for undesirable figures. He wasn't looking for criminals in the traditional sense. Rather, he was on the hunt for anyone who he thought didn't belong. With a flick of his lights, he set off into the night, ready to patrol the familiar streets of Riverside. Meanwhile, across town, 29-year-old attorney Tessa Walker was navigating her way through the evening traffic after a late meeting with a local civil rights group. 2 days earlier, Tessa had been appointed as an interim judge, a monumental achievement that filled her heart with both excitement and responsibility. She had just been named one of the youngest judges in Riverside County's history, and she was also the first black woman to be appointed to the newly created Community Integrity Court. While her official swearing-in ceremony was still a week away, the legal community had already started buzzing with her name and her growing reputation as a formidable figure in the courtroom. Though she was exhausted, Tessa felt energized by the possibilities her new position held. She had spent the evening discussing strategies with her fellow activists, focusing on how to reduce recidivism rates among youth offenders. Now, as she made her way back to her apartment on the north side of the city, her car glided effortlessly through the evening traffic. The weight of the day began to settle on her shoulders, but she felt a sense of purpose driving her forward. She knew her life was about to change in ways she hadn't fully grasped yet. Little did either of them know, this night would be the one that set their paths on a collision course, one that would not only reshape their futures but also challenge the very systems of power, justice, and prejudice that define their lives. As Tessa drove toward her home, unaware of the officer trailing her, she was just another person on the road. But soon, she would become the key player in a story that would expose the deep-rooted injustices hidden beneath the surface, where power, prejudice, and karma would collide in a stunning twist of fate. Tessa Walker's old Toyota Camry, a car she'd meticulously cared for since law school, hummed softly under her hands as she navigated the streets of Riverside. The mellow strains of jazz filled the car as she tapped her fingers on the steering wheel. It had been a long day, but she wasn't tired yet. The world outside her windows was moving, bustling, as she tried to unwind after a late meeting with a local civil rights group. The night was just beginning to pick up speed, the city's energy palpable. Tessa wasn't aware that this very night, a night that seemed as aimless as the gentle jazz she was listening to, would take a dramatic turn, shaping both her destiny and that of the officer who would soon cross her path. In the distance, Officer Jason Clark started his engine with a sense of unease tugging at his chest. He flicked on his patrol lights, scanning the streets with restless energy. His job had become a game of sorts, always searching for someone, anyone, to pull over, itching for a reason to assert his authority. His shift had barely begun, but he already felt a familiar tension building. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows across the deserted road. The clock on Tessa's dashboard read 10:18 p.m., and her car glided through a street lined with old brick buildings, the faded remnants of Riverside's industrial past. Many of these buildings had their windows shuttered, long past their prime. The neighborhood had a mixed reputation, famous for its nightlife, but also notorious for frequent police stops, particularly those targeting black drivers. Tessa had been driving without any real concern. She wasn't speeding. All her lights were working fine, and her registration had been renewed just a month before. Yet, despite all that, as she glanced in her rearview mirror, something about the presence of the squad car behind her made her stomach tighten. It wasn't the lights or sirens that made her nervous. It was the familiar, oppressive feeling, one she had learned to live with as a black woman in Riverside. Her discomfort was instinctive, something she couldn't fully explain but knew all too well. Without warning, the sharp sound of sirens broke the stillness of the night. Blue and red lights danced in the mirror. Tessa's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, she was just heading home. But still, that gut-wrenching feeling she couldn't shake stirred within her. As a lawyer and a soon-to-be judge, Tessa knew the law inside and out. Yet, even as a woman on the cusp of a historic appointment, she couldn't avoid the gut-deep fear that came with being stopped by someone like Officer Clark, whose reputation for misconduct was known among the community. The thought flashed across her mind: what if this was the moment where things went terribly wrong? Tessa obediently flicked on her right turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. She took a deep breath, mentally running through the standard protocol: keys out, hands visible, and, if she could manage it, a smile. Even as she reminded herself of the steps, her hands trembled slightly. She opened the glove compartment to retrieve her license, insurance, and registration. As she did, she could feel the officer's gaze on her. A moment later, Officer Clark sauntered up to her window. His face was hard, jaw clenched, and his demeanor screamed hostility. Tessa forced herself to remain calm. "Good evening, officer," Tessa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Clark leaned in, his eyes briefly scanning her features and the interior of her car. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just held out his hand, waiting for the documents. "License and registration," he ordered, his voice sharp. Tessa handed him the papers. Her sense of dread continued to grow, a gnawing feeling in her gut that something wasn't right. "Here you go," she said softly, still trying to keep her composure. He took the documents without a word and disappeared back into his patrol car. Time dragged. The minutes ticked on. It felt like an eternity before Clark returned, his expression even sterner than before. "You in a hurry, ma'am?" he asked, though his tone carried a loaded implication. It felt less like a question and more like an accusation. "Not particularly," Tessa replied, maintaining eye contact with him. "Is something wrong?" Clark remained silent, his gaze heavy, as if daring her to speak out of turn. She sensed the hostility radiating off him, and her heart beat faster. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to provoke her, to make her seem like the one in the wrong. Tessa's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "You made a wide turn back there," Clark finally said, though his words seemed weak, lacking conviction. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Tessa's heart skipped a beat. The request was not just a suggestion. It was an order. But she was well aware of her rights. She knew the law. She had studied it, lived by it. The thought of stepping out of the car, especially on a nearly deserted street with an officer whose body language screamed aggression, felt dangerous. "Officer, am I being detained?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. His face stiffened. "Step out now," he ordered, his hand twitching near his holster. Tessa glanced around. The sidewalks were empty, the nearest witness a block away in a convenience store. She could see the faint glow of a security camera above the store, but it was too far to be of any help in a situation like this. She took another deep breath. This could escalate quickly. Legally, Clark had no right to force her out of the car, but she also knew that resisting could lead to a much worse outcome. Reluctantly, Tessa opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Clark didn't wait for her to gather her thoughts. He spun her around and pressed her against the hood of her car. The cold metal felt like a slap to her senses. "Spread your arms," he barked. Tessa felt humiliation rise in her chest. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice raising slightly with indignation. "I haven't done anything wrong." Clark didn't respond. He began patting her down, his touch rough and unprofessional. Her mind raced with indignation. She considered revealing her identity. After all, she was a lawyer, soon to be a judge, but something told her it wouldn't make any difference. He would see it as a challenge. Once he was done, he spun her around to face him. His eyes seemed to search for fear or submission, but Tessa stood tall, refusing to let him see her discomfort. "Got anything in the car I need to know about?" he asked, his voice thick with insinuation. "No," she responded firmly. Clark glanced at her car. "Mind if I look?" "Do you have probable cause?" Tessa asked, careful to keep her tone polite but assertive. "Unless I'm being arrested, you don't have the right to search." He sneered, taking her hesitation as a challenge. "Look, lady, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. I'll write you a citation for reckless driving. Maybe resisting or interfering with an investigation. You want that?" Tessa knew that refusing might mean hours of delay, or worse. She glanced around again. The security camera was still there, but it wouldn't help much in this moment. "Fine," she muttered under her breath. "Go ahead." Clark pulled out a flashlight and began rummaging through her car. Tessa stood still, arms crossed, her anger building with each passing second. She listened to the sounds of him rifling through the glove compartment, the back seat, searching for anything to justify his aggression. When he found nothing, he returned to her with a smirk on his face. "You like giving cops a hard time?" he asked, stepping closer. Tessa inhaled slowly, determined not to show her fear. "I'm simply exercising my rights, officer." He regarded her for a moment with annoyance, then gave a curt nod. He handed her back her license and registration. "Go on. Get out of here," he said, his lip curling into a sneer. "And watch your driving." Tessa reclaimed her documents, her hand trembling slightly as she stuffed them into her purse. She climbed back into her car, slamming the door shut harder than she intended. Her heart was pounding, her temples aching, but she had made it through, this time. She started the engine, pulled away, and tried not to look back at the officer standing there, watching her leave. But little did Clark know, the woman he had just humiliated would soon be the one who would decide his fate. Tessa Walker's mind raced as she drove through the city, her heart still pounding from the harrowing encounter just moments ago. As she slowed to a stop at a red light, a wave of nausea overtook her. The full weight of the situation settled in, and the realization hit her. This could have gone horribly wrong. Her pulse quickened again, and she reached into the cup holder to grab her phone. Her fingers trembled as she debated whether to call the police station and file a complaint right away. But she already knew the complexities of filing complaints against officers like Jason Clark, how often they were ignored, how the system often protected its own. A million thoughts spun in her head. Should she tell her mentor, Judge Evelyn Moore, about what happened? Should she contact someone from the civil rights group she had just met with? She could already hear them urging her to take immediate action to set an example, to be the voice for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But at that moment, all Tessa wanted was the safety of her apartment. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and in desperate need of peace. When she finally pulled into the parking garage of her building, she noticed that her hand was still shaking. She cut the engine and leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, her thoughts swirling. "You're safe now," she whispered to herself. "It's over." But another voice inside her whispered that it wasn't truly over. Officers like Clark didn't stop with one bad encounter. The memory of his sneer, the unmistakable prejudice in his eyes, stayed with her, haunting her thoughts. He had humiliated her, detaining her on flimsy grounds, performing an invasive search, and trying to intimidate her. The law clearly stated that such a stop was an overreach, yet he had done it with brazen confidence. How many others had he done this to? She wondered. How many people had ended up in jail simply because they didn't know their rights? The thought gnawed at her as she made her way to her apartment. The familiar space felt strange, a shadow cast over it by the events of the evening. She turned on a single lamp and stood in the dim light for a long moment, contemplating what had happened. Her mind drifted to her upcoming appointment as a judge, her swearing-in ceremony just a week away. Tessa undressed and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water cascade over her as she closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. She visualized the upcoming days, the moment her appointment as a judge would be announced, the public ceremony at the Westfield County Courthouse, where she would take her seat as one of the youngest judges in the county's history. She'd be tasked with presiding over minor cases, first, traffic offenses, community disputes, before moving on to more complex trials. As she stood there, the sting of the night's events lingered. Part of her dreaded stepping onto the bench, carrying the fresh wound of tonight's trauma with her. But another part of her felt a flicker of resolve. She was in a position to make a real difference, and that was something she had to use. The thought steadied her, giving her the strength to move forward. Across town, Officer Jason Clark had ended his shift and was sitting in his living room with a lukewarm beer in hand. A sports channel played on the TV, but he wasn't paying much attention. His mind replayed the events of the night, over and over. Something about that woman, Tessa Walker, had irked him. The calmness in her voice, the poised way she questioned him. She hadn't looked at him with fear. No, she had looked at him with indignation and a certain self-assurance that bothered him. He shrugged it off, telling himself that he had done the right thing by pulling her over. In his world, certain neighborhoods bred criminals, and certain people were more likely to be suspicious. He had convinced himself of this for years, soaking up the toxic belief systems of a few like-minded colleagues while ignoring the voices of others on the force who tried to challenge him. "Probably some fancy college kid," he muttered under his breath, switching off the TV. "Thinks she can talk back to me just because she knows her rights?" Jason tossed the empty beer can in the trash, stumbled to his bedroom, and collapsed onto the bed. Tomorrow was another day of patrolling, and he would put tonight's encounter behind him, just like he always did. But neither of them slept well that night. One was haunted by the feeling of injustice, while the other was plagued by an uneasy irritation that he couldn't quite name. The morning sunlight filtered through Tessa's curtains, pulling her from a restless sleep. She rose earlier than usual, determined to move forward. Her thoughts went back to the incident the night before. After some consideration, She decided to confide in someone who would understand the complexities of law enforcement from the inside, her close friend, Detective Monica Harris. Monica, a fellow woman of color, worked in Riverside's Internal Affairs Division and had seen firsthand the struggles and injustices that permeated the police force. She was someone Tessa trusted wholeheartedly, someone who had been there for her through law school woes and heartbreaks. They met at a quiet cafe near City Hall, a place where Tessa could share her experience in peace. Monica arrived in plain clothes, looking worn from a recent overnight shift. But when she saw the tense expression on Tessa's face, her concern was immediate. "Cam, you okay?" she asked, settling into the chair opposite her friend. Tessa sipped her coffee, steadying herself. "I got pulled over last night, Monica. By an officer named Jason Clark. He had no grounds. He was extremely aggressive." Monica's jaw tightened. "Clark? That name rings a bell. I've heard complaints about him before, but nothing has ever stuck. I think there were some internal investigations a while back, but they all got closed due to insufficient evidence." Tessa exhaled sharply, feeling the frustration build again. That's exactly the problem. These officers operate under the radar because no one can hold them accountable. I'm debating whether I should file a formal complaint, but there's so much going on right now with my new appointment. The public eye. I don't want this to become a distraction. Monica gave a knowing smile. Or you don't want to paint a target on your back now that you're stepping into a high-profile role as a judge? Tessa nodded reluctantly. That too. But I also feel a responsibility. Harper shouldn't be allowed to keep doing this to people. If he felt free to do it to me, and I'm an attorney, can you imagine how he treats others who don't know how to push back? Monica reached across the table, resting a reassuring hand over Tessa's. I'll keep my ear to the ground, but I understand if you want to wait until after your ceremony next week. You want to start off on the right foot, not mired in controversy. After a few moments of silence, Tessa murmured, "Let me think on it. I'll keep you posted for now. I just need to focus on my swearing in and my new responsibilities." Monica nodded. "I get it. And hey, you know where to find me if you need backup." Tessa smiled, feeling grateful for Monica's unwavering support. In the days that followed, Tessa immersed herself in preparations for her new role. She met with court administrators, discussed upcoming cases, and steeled her nerves for the public ceremony that would officially appoint her as a judge. She ordered a new robe, carefully chosen to fit her small frame, and reviewed her docket, noting that her first day would involve several traffic and misdemeanor cases, a fitting start, she thought bitterly, after her own unjust traffic stop. Tessa couldn't help but feel a twinge of dread, but she knew she was ready. As she worked tirelessly to prepare for her new position, the weight of the moment loomed over her, knowing she had the power to change lives, to make decisions that could affect people's futures. But she also knew that she couldn't forget what had happened. The events of the past few days had shown her just how far some officers would go to abuse their power, and just how important it was for her, in her new role, to make sure that didn't happen under her watch. Name was David Anderson, a retired schoolteacher in his late 50s, who had been pulled over by Officer Harper on a quiet street not unlike the one where Tessa had been stopped. The case was strikingly similar, though the victim had not been as fortunate as Tessa to escape without injury. The incident had resulted in David suffering a fractured arm, compounded by allegations of racial slurs from Harper during the altercation. A bystander, who had been passing by at the time, managed to capture part of the incident on their phone, footage that could prove pivotal in the case. As the prosecutor, Adrian Lowe, laid out the facts of the case with precision, Tessa couldn't help but feel a tightness in her chest. The more she listened, the more she realized that this wasn't just any case. This was the moment she had feared and anticipated, the moment when her personal history with Officer Clark, now revealed as Officer Glenn Harper, would come to collide with her professional duty. Her mind flashed back to that night. The humiliation, the uncertainty, the feeling of being powerless under the weight of his authority, all of it rushed back in a wave. But now, she wasn't just another victim of harassment. She was the one who would decide Harper's fate, and with that knowledge came an immense responsibility. The weight of her judicial robe seemed to settle heavier on her shoulders as the room seemed to shrink. Every eye in the courtroom was on her now, waiting for her to make a decision that could impact the lives of everyone involved. Tessa's heart raced as she struggled to maintain her composure. She glanced at the defense table where Harper sat, his posture rigid, his face a mixture of discomfort and defiance. He hadn't yet realized who was presiding over his case. His lawyer, Richard Cohen, stood confidently beside him, prepared to defend his client's actions, convinced of Harper's innocence. "Your Honor," Cohen spoke up, breaking the silence that had settled after the prosecution's presentation. "We request an immediate review of the evidence. Officer Harper acted within the scope of his duties, and we believe that the charges against him are exaggerated and unjust." Tessa nodded thoughtfully, her fingers briefly touching the gavel before her. The words of Cohen and the evidence being presented before her swirled in her mind. She had to remain impartial, her role as a judge demanded it, but it was increasingly difficult to separate her personal feelings from the case. As much as she wanted to act on the anger and frustration from her own encounter with Harper, she knew that justice, true justice, would only come if she could put aside her emotions and judge the case solely on the evidence before her. But the line between her personal experience and her professional duty was beginning to blur. The room fell silent again as Tessa looked over the case file in front of her. The information was damning: multiple complaints against Harper, a history of similar incidents, and the video evidence from a bystander. Yet, as she reviewed it all, she couldn't help but hesitate. Legally, she knew she could proceed with the case. She had every right to rule in favor of the prosecution. But ethically, if she recognized Harper as the officer who had harassed her only days earlier, should she recuse herself from the case to preserve the integrity of the court? The question gnawed at her. But then, as she glanced back at Harper, she realized something. His gaze had shifted. It was then that he noticed who was sitting at the bench. His eyes narrowed, his expression flickering with confusion. Tessa's stomach dropped. The recognition was instantaneous. He knew exactly who she was now. The realization seemed to hit him like a freight train, and she saw the briefest flash of panic cross his face. Tessa cleared her throat, making her voice steady and even as she addressed the courtroom. "Officer Harper, you stand before this court for a preliminary hearing on charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct. This hearing will determine if there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Do you have counsel present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Harper's attorney, Richard Cohen, responded smoothly. "We are entering a plea of not guilty and requesting an immediate review of evidence. We believe that Officer Harper acted within the scope of his duties." Tessa nodded, trying to block out the rushing thoughts in her mind as she let the process unfold. "Very well. The prosecution may proceed with an outline of the evidence and witness statements." Prosecutor Lowe stepped forward, presenting the facts with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. The details were chilling. David Anderson, the victim, had been pulled over by Harper for a broken taillight. But the situation escalated rapidly, with Harper using excessive force during the stop. The victim's arm had been fractured in the altercation, and there were claims of racial slurs uttered by Harper during the encounter. The bystander's video footage further corroborated the victim's testimony, showing Harper's actions in stark detail. Tessa felt her chest tighten with each new revelation. She wanted to leap to action, to ensure that Harper paid for what he had done, not only to David Anderson but also to her. But she knew that a judge's role wasn't to react out of anger or personal history. It was her job to listen, to weigh the facts, and to let the law guide her decisions. As Lowe continued to lay out the case, Tessa's gaze lingered on Harper. His discomfort was apparent now, and it was clear that he recognized the situation. His defiance had wavered, replaced with an almost palpable tension. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of what was at stake, but Tessa had to remain neutral. She could not let her personal feelings cloud her judgment, no matter how much Harper's actions had wounded her. The memory of that night, of his sneer and the power he had abused, would have to stay locked away for now. Her duty was to the court, to the law, and to the people who depended on her fairness. The defense presented their case next. Harper, taking the stand, tried to explain his actions, claiming that Anderson had reached for something in his car, something he believed to be a weapon. The justification sounded rehearsed, like an argument he had given many times before. But as Tessa listened, she couldn't shake the feeling that Harper was simply trying to cover up his past mistakes, trying to explain away his brutal actions with a convenient story. The tension in the room continued to build as the defense's arguments faltered under scrutiny. The video evidence was a key piece, one that couldn't be easily dismissed. And when the defense lawyer, Cohen, attempted to discredit the victim and witness, Tessa kept her composure, allowing only the relevant facts to be presented. As the day stretched on, the trial neared its closing arguments. Tessa sat back in her chair, eyes scanning the room, her thoughts sharp and focused. She was more than just a judge now. She was the one who would decide whether a police officer, sworn to protect, would face consequences for the harm he had caused. And in that moment, Tessa knew that this wasn't just about one man's fate. It was about sending a message. Justice had to be served, not only for David Anderson but for everyone who had ever been silenced by officers like Harper. When the final verdict was delivered, Tessa's hand moved to the gavel. She tapped it firmly, bringing the court to order, her voice steady and resolute. It is the finding of this court that there is sufficient evidence to proceed with the charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct against Officer Glenn Harper. The case will proceed to trial. The room fell into a stunned silence as Tessa met Harper's gaze one last time. The once proud officer now seemed diminished, his defiance replaced with shock and something else, fear. It was a long time coming. Justice, though delayed, had finally caught up with him. Exists to proceed with the charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct against Officer Glenn Harper. The case will proceed to trial pending scheduling and assignment to a trial court. The courtroom fell silent, a collective breath held in the air as Tessa's gavel echoed in the stillness. Officer Harper's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes wide as the weight of the decision settled on him. His attorney, Richard Cohen, immediately requested a sidebar, but Tessa waved him off. "Any further motions should be filed in writing," she said coolly, before standing from the bench. "This hearing is concluded." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the bailiff ushered Harper out, his lawyer following closely behind, their faces taut with anxiety. Tessa remained seated for a moment, her heart pounding as she tried to compose herself. The decision to proceed with charges had not been an easy one, but she had made it based on the evidence, her sense of duty overriding her personal emotions. But deep inside, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought, Harper would face consequences now, but for how long would the system protect officers like him? As the attorneys gathered their files and exited the courtroom, Tessa slowly made her way to her chambers, each step weighed down by the burden of what had just transpired. She sat down at her desk, her fingers brushing over the case file, still rattled by the testimony and video she had just reviewed. The case had been open for months, yet in that moment, it felt as though her entire career had led her to this very point. Her decision would have far-reaching consequences for both Harper and the system she now had the power to change. Tessa reached for the phone on her desk and dialed the number of her closest friend, Detective Monica Harris, a fellow woman of color who worked in Riverside's Internal Affairs Division. Monica had seen it all, the injustices, the abuses of power, and Tessa trusted her completely. She needed to speak to someone who would understand the gravity of the situation. Monica arrived at Tessa's office half an hour later, her expression filled with concern. She closed the door behind her, and Tessa immediately began explaining everything that had happened: the harrowing traffic stop, the charges of misconduct, the eerie sense of déjà vu that had swept over her when she first recognized Harper's name on the case. Monica listened quietly, absorbing the weight of Tessa's words. "You're in a tough spot," Monica finally said, her voice soft but firm. "You know the ethical guidelines. If you were a direct victim, you'd have to recuse yourself. But at the same time, this isn't just about you, is it? It's about justice." Tessa nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the case file in front of her. "I was personally affected by what happened with Harper. He violated my rights, just like he violated Malcolm Harris's. But it wasn't documented, not officially. Does that make a difference?" Monica hesitated, tapping her fingers on the desk. "Legally, it might. Practically, though, it's a judgment call. Some judges choose not to recuse themselves if the connection is tangential. And in your case, you weren't involved in a formal investigation. You have no official connection to this case." Tessa's frustration bubbled up. "But I know who he is. I saw his face, I felt his hostility. I can't just pretend that doesn't matter." Monica placed a hand on her shoulder, a comforting gesture. "I get it. You're personally invested, and it feels wrong to ignore it. But as a judge, your job is to ensure that the process is fair. That the evidence is what drives your decision, not personal feelings. You can ensure that the victim is heard, that the evidence is scrutinized properly. It's about upholding the law." Tessa took a deep breath, processing Monica's words. She knew her friend was right. The case was about far more than her own personal experience. It was about the system, and whether she would uphold the integrity of that system or let her emotions cloud her judgment. "I'll proceed carefully," Tessa said, her voice steady. "But if at any point I feel my personal history with Harper is influencing my actions, I'll recuse myself and hand it over to another judge." Monica gave her a small, encouraging smile. "That's the right call. And remember, I'm here if you need anything." After Monica left, Tessa sat alone in her office, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She reread the case file for the third time, focusing on the victim's testimony, the bystander's video, and the corroborating statements. If everything aligned, the evidence was strong enough to move forward with charges against Harper. But a hearing was only the beginning. The real battle would come in the trial, which could stretch on for months. "I won't let him slip through," Tessa thought firmly. "But I won't violate my oath either." The following day, the courtroom was filled with tension as the hearing resumed. The prosecution presented the grainy, shaky footage captured by a bystander, footage that showed Harper slamming David Anderson against the hood of his patrol car, twisting his arm behind his back with excessive force. David's cries of pain were audible, a testament to the brutality of the encounter. Harper's expression remained stoic, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He sat through the prosecution's presentation, trying to maintain a facade of confidence, but his discomfort was palpable. His attorney, Richard Cohen, immediately challenged the video, arguing that it didn't provide the full context, that the victim had been resisting arrest, and no racial slurs had been heard. The defense's argument rang hollow in Tessa's ears. She knew better. She had seen officers like Harper before, men who used their power to intimidate, who saw citizens as nothing more than obstacles to be controlled. And with each word Cohen spoke, Tessa felt the anger rise inside her. Next, David Anderson took the stand. His voice trembled as he recounted the incident, describing how he had been pulled over for a minor infraction and how Harper's demeanor had quickly turned aggressive. He spoke of the pain in his arm, of the fear that had consumed him during the encounter. Every word he spoke was a painful reminder of the injustice that had been done, not just to him, but to countless others who had been mistreated by officers like Harper. Tessa's hands gripped the sides of her bench as she listened. She kept her face neutral, but inside, she was boiling. How many people had been victimized under the guise of law enforcement? How many times had Harper gotten away with this? When Harper took the stand, his story was rehearsed, his words empty. He claimed that Anderson had reached for something in the car, that he had feared for his safety and used force to restrain him. But Tessa wasn't fooled. His story didn't hold up. The video, the victim's testimony, these were the facts that mattered. And it was her job to ensure those facts were heard. Once the testimony concluded, Tessa retreated to her chambers, her mind spinning as she deliberated. The burden of proof was not to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but to establish enough evidence for the case to proceed to trial. And as much as she wanted to take personal revenge, she knew that wasn't her role. The evidence was strong. The video, the testimony, it was enough to move forward. When she emerged from her chambers, her decision was clear. "It is the finding of this court," she began, her voice steady, "that there is sufficient evidence to proceed with the charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct against Officer Glenn Harper. The case will proceed to trial." The gavel struck, and the room fell silent. The road ahead would be long, but Tessa had made her decision. Officer Harper would face the consequences of his actions. And for the first time in a long time, Tessa felt that justice might actually be served. Malcolm's arm even after he had been subdued. "How do you explain that, Officer Harper?" Prosecutor Lowe's voice was firm and direct, his eyes locking onto Harper's with a sharp, cutting gaze. Harper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the witness stand. The words he had rehearsed, the defenses he had prepared, began to slip away as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had been caught in too many lies, and now, under the scrutiny of the courtroom, the weight of his actions was becoming unbearable. I used the force necessary to restrain him," Harper muttered, though his voice faltered. "He was resisting, and I thought he might have had a weapon." It was a tense situation. The prosecutor's gaze never wavered as he continued, "But there's no evidence of resistance in the video. There's nothing that shows Mr. Harris making any threatening movements. In fact, it's clear that he was complying with your orders." The audience in the courtroom seemed to lean forward in unison, waiting for Harper's next words. But he remained silent, squirming under the pressure. Camilla observed carefully, her expression neutral. She wasn't just a judge in this moment, she was also a woman who had felt the sting of injustice herself. As she listened to Harper's testimony, the echoes of her own confrontation with him reverberated in her mind. The same man who had humiliated her on that dark, lonely street was now trying to justify his actions under the glare of courtroom lights. And as much as she fought to keep her personal feelings at bay, it was impossible not to feel the heat of anger rising within her. The defense attorney, Richard Cohen, tried his best to salvage the situation. He quickly interjected, arguing that the prosecution was misinterpreting the situation, painting a picture that was far from the truth. Cohen was a seasoned lawyer, but his argument was crumbling. As Harper's defense grew weaker, so did the faith in his story. Tessa, from her bench, noticed Harper's discomfort. His stance had shifted from confident to defensive. The tension in the room heightened as the defense rested. The prosecution had presented its case clearly and concisely, backing it with video evidence and witness testimony. Yet, Camilla knew that this was only the beginning of what was to come. She was keenly aware that the path ahead was going to be arduous. A decision had to be made. Her responsibility now was to ensure that the proceedings stayed fair and just, no matter her own emotional attachment to the case. After the break, the room slowly filled again. Camilla sat in her chambers, her fingers lightly tapping on the desk as she reviewed the case file. She was torn between her legal duty to stay impartial and the burning desire for accountability. The decision she would make next could set a powerful precedent for others in her position. Her phone buzzed with a message from Helena, a reminder that Harper had recognized her. "He knows who you are. Be careful," the message read. Camilla looked at the phone, her heart racing. The implications of this were more significant than just this trial. If Harper's defense attorney found out that she had been involved in the initial encounter, they would certainly claim bias. The courtroom battle was as much about public perception as it was about the truth. If she recused herself, it might appear as though she were running from the responsibility of hearing the case. On the other hand, if she stayed and Harper's defense lawyer found out, they would argue that she couldn't possibly be objective. Camilla knew she had to tread carefully. Her decision was clear. She dialed Judge Sarita Hill, her mentor, who had been guiding her throughout her early days as a judge. She explained everything, how Harper had recognized her, the ethical dilemma, and her internal conflict. Judge Hill listened intently, her voice calm but full of wisdom. "This is a tricky position, Camilla. You do have a personal history with the defendant. But technically, no formal complaint has been filed. Legally, there's no official record that ties you to him." Camilla sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know what he did to me. I experienced his harassment firsthand. But if I don't recuse myself, will I still be seen as fair? I can't let him get away with this." Judge Hill paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "The real question is, can you still be impartial? Can you weigh the evidence without allowing personal feelings to influence your judgment? If you believe you can, then proceed. But if you feel that your personal experience with him is clouding your ability to be fair, then the right thing to do is to step aside." The words settled into Camilla's mind. "I'll stay. But I'll stay only if I can remain impartial. If at any point I feel I can, I'll recuse myself. But I won't let him get away with it again." Judge Hill's voice softened with encouragement. "You're doing the right thing. You have the ability to ensure justice is served. Just don't lose sight of the bigger picture." The trial resumed a week later, and the courtroom was packed. The media had started to pay attention, with several journalists from major news outlets ready to cover the case. Camilla stepped onto the bench with the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had made her decision, but the journey ahead would be difficult. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her, the expectation that she would remain fair, objective, and above reproach. Officer Harper entered the courtroom in a tailored suit, his expression hardened and unreadable. His defense attorney, Richard Cohen, sat next to him, looking smug and self-assured. It was clear that the defense was going to try everything to protect Harper from the charges that had been leveled against him. The prosecutor, Adrian Lowe, was the first to address the court. He began with an impassioned opening statement, outlining the evidence against Harper. The video, which had captured Harper using excessive force on the victim, Malcolm Harris, was shown again. Camilla could see the reaction of the jury. Some were visibly disturbed by the footage, others skeptical, unsure of what to believe. "The video is clear," Adrian said. "Officer Harper abused his power and violated the rights of an innocent man. His actions are an example of police misconduct and racial profiling. This case is about accountability." The defense quickly countered, attempting to discredit the video, claiming that it didn't provide the full context. There was a threat. Officer Harper was acting in good faith to protect himself, Cohen argued. The victim was resisting arrest. This entire case is a sensationalized narrative with little basis in reality. Camilla's mind was sharp. She listened intently, carefully analyzing every word. It was clear that the defense was relying heavily on spinning the narrative to protect Harper. But the video didn't lie. The evidence was substantial, and Camilla knew that this trial would be about more than just one incident. It was about the wider issues of power, abuse, and justice within the police force. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Witness after witness testified, painting a picture of an officer willing to go to extreme lengths to assert his dominance. The defense tried to discredit them, but their testimony held weight. Then came the critical moment. The eyewitness, Isaiah Turner, took the stand. He recounted hearing Harper's racial slurs during the arrest, further corroborating the victim's account. With each passing hour, the case against Harper grew stronger. And with every piece of evidence, Camilla's resolve solidified. She was there to uphold justice, not to serve her own personal vendettas. Prison. Camilla sat in ChatGPT Hanoi. Her chambers, alone for the first time in days. The weight of the decision she had just made settled heavily on her shoulders, but she knew it was the right one. Her duty had been clear, and she had followed it with unwavering commitment. As much as she had hoped for justice, she hadn't anticipated the relief she now felt. Justice had been served, not just for Malcolm Harris, but for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of officers like Harper. The room was quiet, the usual hum of activity outside her chambers now muffled, as if the world outside had taken a collective breath. She sat back in her chair, glancing at the papers before her, sentencing documents, a reminder of the process that had brought them here. In a few days, the media frenzy would die down, and life would continue. But for now, it felt as though she had made a difference in a way that no one could undo. Her mind wandered to the conversations she had shared with her mentor, Judge Sarita Hill, and her friend, Detective Helena Rosales. They had been there to guide her through the most complicated case of her career. She thought of the many difficult conversations they'd had, about fairness, justice, and the responsibility of her position. Camilla smiled faintly as she thought of the support she had received. Her friends, her family, the people who had believed in her. Now, more than ever, she understood the importance of their unwavering faith. She had been through a trial herself, not just in the courtroom, but in her own heart. And now, it was over. Outside, the protests over Harper's sentencing continued, but there was a sense of closure in the air. For Camilla, there was a bittersweet recognition that this moment of victory would not be her last struggle. In a city as big as Chicago, as entrenched in its systems as it was, there would always be more work to be done. Yet, as she took a deep breath, Camilla felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She had stepped onto the bench not just to fulfill a legal duty, but to make a real impact, to challenge the injustices she had personally experienced. The fight was far from over, but for now, the scales of justice had tipped in favor of the right side. And that was enough. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the city, Camilla knew that her work as a judge had only just begun. There would be more cases, more challenges, and perhaps more officers like Harper to confront. But she would face them all with the same resolve, knowing that the law was not just a set of rules, it was a powerful tool to bring about real change. And that was why she was here. To bring justice, no matter the cost. The end of one chapter, Camilla realized, was only the beginning of another. The weight of the gavel in her hand no longer felt heavy, it felt like a promise. Camilla sat alone in her chambers, reflecting on the outcome of the trial. The weight of the decision was heavy, a mixture of relief and sadness. She didn't take any satisfaction in sending someone to prison, especially someone who had once worn the same uniform that she herself had once respected. But justice demanded it. Officer Glenn Harper had abused his power and tarnished the badge he once wore with authority. It was the harsh reality of a system that, when it worked as it should, was supposed to protect the innocent. The system had failed Malcolm Harris that night, and now it was time for accountability. In the days that followed, Camilla made the quiet but necessary effort to show Malcolm that he was not alone in his struggle. She wrote him a personal letter, expressing her heartfelt sympathy for the injuries he had suffered. She encouraged him to seek any additional resources he might need, though she kept the letter simple and discreet. It was her way of making sure he knew he had support, especially after the traumatic experience he had endured. It was the right thing to do, both as a judge and as a human being, but she made sure to respect the ethical boundaries of her role, keeping her actions without fanfare. Meanwhile, her conversation with Detective Helena Rosales confirmed what Camilla had suspected. Harper's case had sparked further scrutiny within the police force. The Internal Affairs Division had been flooded with complaints against Harper. These new allegations had the potential to lead to further investigations, and with the growing attention, there were talks of reform within the department. The public outcry was calling for better supervision of officers with a history of misconduct. Ideas for new training programs and community oversight committees were being tossed around, though Camilla knew that while these initiatives were necessary, they were far from a perfect solution. Still, she hoped they would be a start, a step in the right direction for long overdue change. Camilla carried on with her duties, adjudicating other cases with the same focus and commitment to fairness she had always had. She maintained her role as an impartial judge, even as she carried the burden of that fateful traffic stop. The encounter had opened her eyes to the urgency of reform in both the law enforcement system and the justice system itself. Fate had put her in a position to make a difference, and she was determined to carry that responsibility with honor. But despite her professional composure, in the quiet moments, she allowed herself a small sense of closure. She had stood up against the kind of prejudice and abuse she had once faced. She had fought for justice, and in doing so, she had shown both the city and herself that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still be served. The weight of the gavel, once heavy with uncertainty, now felt like a reminder of what was at stake every day in her courtroom. It was a symbol of her unwavering commitment to righting the wrongs she had witnessed and experienced in her own life. Judge Camilla Robinson's journey had been one of reclaiming her dignity, exposing wrongdoing, and standing steadfast in her pursuit of justice. It wasn't an easy path, and it came with its own set of challenges, but she had proven that integrity and perseverance could prevail even in the face of overwhelming odds. She was determined to make sure her journey was not just a personal triumph but a reminder to everyone that the law was a tool for real change. If this story resonates with you, Camilla's journey stands as a powerful testament to the importance of standing up for what's right. It reminds us that no matter the challenges, justice can be served, and that integrity is a cornerstone of the work we do in the pursuit of fairness for all. Thank you for joining us on this emotional roller coaster where one fateful traffic stop turned the tables on a corrupt officer and ushered in true justice. The story of Judge Camilla Robinson teaches us that justice is not always simple, but it is always essential. It serves as a powerful reminder that those who wield power, whether in law enforcement, the judiciary, or any other position, must do so with integrity and accountability. Camilla's journey highlights how personal experiences, especially ones shaped by systemic injustice, can shape one's understanding of fairness and inspire a commitment to making the system better. In her case, despite being a victim of unjust treatment by Officer Harper, Camilla did not let her personal emotions cloud her judgment. She understood the importance of adhering to the law impartially, focusing on the facts of the case and letting the evidence speak for itself. The story also emphasizes the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the stakes are high and the system seems stacked against you. By holding Officer Harper accountable, Camilla not only fought for Malcolm Harris but also for countless other individuals who have suffered under the weight of prejudice and abuse of power. This story underscores the need for reform, transparency, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Change doesn't come easily or quickly, but it begins with individuals who are willing to challenge the status quo and make hard decisions. Camilla's actions show that while justice can sometimes feel delayed or difficult to achieve, it is always worth pursuing. The lesson here is that when we stand firm in our commitment to fairness and integrity, even when faced with adversity, we can bring about meaningful change. It encourages us to reflect on our own roles within society and consider how we, too, can contribute to a system that serves all people equally, without bias or prejudice. If this story resonated with you and you believe in the importance of justice, integrity, and accountability, we'd love for you to show your support. Please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire and shed light on important issues. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing meaningful content to you. Thank you for being part of this journey.